Crossroads is honored to have homicide detective Jay Wallace share this dynamic book, Cold Case Christianity. I mean, you take the tough murder cases and you find the killer.
And sometimes it takes a long time. I mean, each of these cases is sometimes 2 years to develop from start to finish. They've been unsolved for so many years.
Why in the world did you want that vocation?
Well, you start off in patrol, and usually when you hire on in an agency, and I did too, and then eventually you get small opportunities to do one kind of an investigation or another, and they see what you can do, and then you kind of get elevated at some point. Hopefully you get to a place where you're working murders. And I did that for a number of years, and then we opened up our cold case team, and I became a founding member of that.
Now, this is a hot book. I heard about this long before you came here. And in the world of apologetics, which is Christian proofs, this book is standing out right now. Did you ever expect that?
No. Are you kidding me? I feel like I'm so blessed to be with my heroes. I mean, I have people who I read that now occasionally I get to bump into and talk to. And I'm thinking, wow, this is like you can imagine being around all your heroes, right? So that's why I feel like I'm very, very lucky.
Let's acknowledge that young people are leaving the church. We know that. 75% of kids raised in church exit.
Yes.
20 to 30 somethings think the church is irrelevant. And the Duke study recently said, at least in the U.S., by 2025, less than 15% of Americans are going to attend church. It also pointed out the majority of Americans attending are in megachurches. So the era of small churches is truly vanishing with a generation change that's imminently coming. These young people have questions.
Yeah, they sure do. And we have to have answers for them. And that's really the difference. I think that we're at a place where I'm not sure we have the luxury of not being good Christian case makers. And it does take an extra step. I mean, some of us are saved by our faith in Christ, but it's almost accident. We haven't even examined why it might be true. So the first time it gets nudged, it gets challenged at the university setting. And I think it happens a lot earlier than that. I think it's happening by the time they're in high school. And certainly when they're out from underneath the cover of their parents in university setting, I think they actually begin to walk away altogether.
And then we have Ivy League schools in the United States, Harvard, and then all of these that were originally designed to train ministers of the gospel. And when you bring their religion departments in, they don't embrace the supernatural. They don't look at the Bible as authoritative. So we got a big challenge before us.
Yeah, and that's why and this is how I came to faith in God, was because I came to faith in Christ through the reliability of the New Testament and the examination I did of the New Testament. So for me, it wasn't, do I believe there's objective truth, and then do I believe there's a God, and then do I believe that Christianity is the only true version of theism. For me, it was almost in the reverse order. I looked at the Gospels, and once I determined them to be reliable, I was stuck with having to do something with the person of Jesus. And so that's how I started looking then. Well, is this reasonable? I mean, could there really be a God? I mean, that's how I kind of looked at the evidences in reverse order, because I was compelled by what I thought was the reliable nature of the eyewitness accounts.
My son Jeremy just finished his 100,000-word dissertation on the resurrection.
You should be very proud of him.
So I had to sit and watch and listen. Yes. He and Craig Evans, a lot of theologians. So let's go. Number one, we have the Gospels. We have stories of Jesus' sermons. Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount. There is no tape recorders there. How do we know we have the exact words?
Well, I think that's an interesting proposal. I think we're talking about a first century culture that's entirely an oral culture of learning. And if you think that's not powerful, I'm going to give you a little illustration of this. I just came back from 7 days in Vancouver. And a young man named Tyson was in the audience. He's followed us around to each presentation. And I was giving, for the most part, the same presentation about Bible reliability over and over and over again, about 4 or 5 times. By the 5th time I changed, we were doing something different that night. And Tyson said to me, "Oh, so good, I want to finish your sentences for you." And I thought to myself, do you really think you can finish? So he started to kind of tease me. And he started to recite back to me entire wholesale paragraphs, or lines of my talk. And I thought, am I that? But this is the nature, I think, of when you have a sermon you give, and you give repeatedly, and you teach on these topics for 3 years. Oh, I do think we've captured more than just the essence of his teaching. I think in many situations we've captured the exact lines, line by line by line, of everything Jesus said. And that doesn't seem all that surprising to me, given my own experience with someone like Tyson, who's been listening carefully just 5 times.
An oral rabbinic culture, shall we say.
Yes.
People tuned in a little better than they do today.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that that's not to be all that surprising. And really, how early are these Gospels written? I think if the argument is, gosh, we've got Gospels that are written in the 2nd and 3rd century, so this is so much time. This oral tradition has to be alive and transmitted for that. Well, you got a problem. But that's not what I think is actually the case. I think there's a very good circumstantial case to be built for the early dating of the Gospels, and I try to make that case in the book, that puts the writers in the right place to be present at the time as eyewitnesses. Doesn't mean they're telling us the truth. They could be lying, but they're present early. Then we use other techniques for reliability to determine if they're telling us the truth.
Okay, here's another one.
All right.
The Gospels became very commercialized. Jesus became a commercialized industry quickly. Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary, a lot of apocryphal Gospels. Mm-hmm. Why the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John? The authors never put their names on them.
Right, so there's always this challenge, and I think Bart Ehrman has probably done the most work in this area to challenge our trust in the New Testament Gospels. One thing's great about examining this as a criminal case. If I'm curious about whether or not a piece of evidence is at the crime scene that is being presented in court years later, how do I know it wasn't dropped into property somewhere in the middle? How do I know it's actually there from the scene of the crime? Well, I look at the chain of custody, and I ask myself, did anyone take a picture of it? And then another person passed it on and examined it, took another picture and passed it on, took another picture and passed it on. I can look at that chain of custody. It turns out we can do the same thing with the Gospels. You can look at John's Gospel and take a look at the very first Polaroid taken in history, which is taken by Ignatius and Papias and Polycarp. Polycarp and Ignatius, we still have their writings.
Right.
We can see, what did John teach them? What does Jesus look like for Ignatius and Polycarp, just one generation removed, and see if that picture matches. Then we can find their student, Irenaeus. Does a picture match? His student, Hippolytus. Does a picture match? And we keep on going through history, looking at the Polaroid of Jesus to see, is the guy who's in the Council of Laodicea in 363, where they first canonized the 27 books of the New Testament, is that version of Jesus the same guy we have a snapshot of over here all through the centuries? And as it turns out, Jesus doesn't change for us. He's not a legend growing over time. He's the same Jesus all the way along.
So why the bias toward ancient history? Homer's Iliad, everybody accepts. We accept Julius Caesar. We accept, so many of these figures. But we come to the Gospels and we don't want to apply the same acceptance. And we have more testation, the word, I guess, scholars use.
Well, I think if we're honest with ourselves, it's because the historians, the secular historians, don't call us to examine who we are and our need for salvation.
That's good.
And part of it is just that I am so willful, even as an unbeliever. I was 35 before I ever stepped foot in a church for anything other than, a funeral or a wedding. At a Protestant church, I had not been even seen live worship. And I can tell you that I had a willful desire to live my own life. You're not going to tell me anything new at 35. I thought I knew everything. And I was a police officer on top of it all, and cops are good at this. We typically tell other folks what they need to do. They don't tell us what we need to do. And so I had a real volitional resistance to hearing the evidence that God has placed in our world to testify to Him. I didn't want to see it because I had a volitional resistance to this. God had to do something first to remove my enmity toward Him, my hostility toward Him. So I think a lot of this is that the historians of antiquity are not asking you to examine who you are and make a change. They're not trying to describe you. But Jesus is good at piercing through that and trying to describe who we really are.
And they probably didn't say John 14:6, I'm the way, truth, and life.
Absolutely.
No man goes to the Father
That's right.
but by
And
me.
so I think that's a claim that I had to take seriously once I looked through the Gospels and realized, wow, they actually satisfy all the requirements I would ask for when examining eyewitnesses.
The charity work, hospitals throughout the world, in the world of artistry, the Rembrandts of the world, I mean, we see such a different impact with the life of Jesus than Buddha, Muhammad, anyone else. What does that tell us?
Well, I tell you, I sometimes get this claim made. I see so many Christian hypocrites. Oh, there's so many people who I know as Christians who have disappointed me. Well, of course, There's a common denominator in every organization filled with humans, and it's that there are humans in it. There are these nasty little dirty things called humans, and we all fail. And so when I look at that, I say, you know, one thing about Christianity is when you see a Christian organization or a period of time of Christians in history where they've failed to be what you think they ought to be, they had to actually live in opposition to the teaching of their founder, Jesus Christ. They weren't living in a robust way that manifests the teaching of their leader. They had to resist the teaching of their leader to be the jerks that we often end up being, right? And so I think that one thing that's great about our worldview, yes, of course it's filled with hypocrites, but not because Jesus was this way. He's called us to something better because we are so willfully, and still even now, I oftentimes will want to do things my way and resist what I know is true.
And the famous American atheist Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who ejected Bible reading and prayer out of public schools, her son, Bill, said he came to Christ because there was so much hostility against Christ. He was convinced there had to be a Christ. Now, the book is called Cold Case Christianity. It's on our e-store. And I want to tell you, this is a book you simply must get. It takes these tremendous principles of a homicide detective and allows you to use them about proofs about Christianity. Thanks so much for being with us.
I really appreciate coming.
And we look forward to God using you in the days ahead. Now stay with us.